John Christie looked like the kind of guy you'd want to have a beer with. Decent looking, well-dressed, good hair. He lived in a nice flat with his wife Ethel. They were a happy couple. Well, sort of. They weren't married. Ethel was actually John's landlady, but they did share a bed. And even though their relationship might not have been socially sanctioned, it was clear that these two loved each other very much. In the early 1950s, John Christie rented a room from Ethel in her boarding house. But when he moved out in 1953, he left behind a horrible secret. The new tenant found a door concealed behind a wardrobe that opened up to a small room where he found the bodies of 7 women. One of them was still breathing. She had somehow survived an axe attack. That woman would go on to tell police that she had been attacked by John Christie himself. And so began one of Britain's most horrific murder investigations, and perhaps the biggest legal F up in history. Because while Christie was certainly a murderer, he wasn't the only one. Another man was also responsible for at least 3 of the deaths. His name was Timothy Evans, and he was an extremely unlikely killer. Timothy was born in 1924. He had a twin sister named June, but they were separated at age 7, and Timothy knew nothing about her existence until he was 60. He had a difficult childhood. His mother was mentally unstable, often leaving him and his father to fend for themselves. As a result, Timothy struggled throughout school, eventually repeating the 3rd grade because he couldn't read or write well enough to pass. At 14, he was already a father. A year later, he enlisted in the Royal Navy but didn't last long. He was sent home in disgrace after just 5 months. By age 21, he was married, and soon he and his wife Beryl had a baby girl they named Geraldine. The 3 lived with Beryl's parents, along with Beryl's sister and her husband. This is going to be important later, so remember that. Beryl's sister's husband's name was John Christie. Timothy, who had a low IQ, was unable to find steady work. He bounced from job to job, never lasting longer than a few weeks. So money was always tight. The arrival of Geraldine made things even worse. She wouldn't sleep at night, which meant Timothy's bosses were constantly complaining about how late he was to work. Eventually, Timothy lost his job entirely, so he and Beryl moved into a basement flat of their own. Beryl's parents gave them some furniture, and they even managed to acquire a television set, something only 13% of British homes had at the time. But there was one thing they didn't have, and that was a refrigerator. This is another detail we'll come back to. While they were struggling financially, Beryl was also getting sick of being a stay-at-home mom. She wanted to get a job, but Timothy didn't like the idea of his wife working outside the home. He also didn't like the fact that Beryl's parents and sister and husband lived so close by. He wanted to move someplace else, and that's when he met John again. John had recently moved to the area and was looking for somewhere to live, and Timothy told him about a vacant room in his building. For John, the choice was simple: move into Timothy's building and pay rent to Beryl's parents, or move into Timothy's basement flat and pay rent to Timothy. John chose the latter and quickly became friendly with the young couple. He was 18 years older than Timothy and almost always dressed to the nines. To Timothy, he was like an older brother. Timothy looked up to him and wanted to be more like him. In fact, Timothy thought John was so great that he let John stay in his flat for free in exchange for helping him fix up the place. But things didn't quite work out the way Timothy hoped. John brought all sorts of problems, mostly women. Timothy found several pairs of women's shoes in the hallway closet and confronted John about them. John told him they weren't his, and that if Timothy minded, he would move out. Timothy backed down. Then he went downstairs to complain to Beryl. Beryl said John could stay, so Timothy decided to move out. But Beryl wouldn't allow him to take their TV with him, so he left it behind. It's at this point that Timothy's story shifts and things get really messed up. Remember earlier when I mentioned that 13% of British homes had TVs? Well, in reality, it was illegal to own a TV without a license. And having a TV was a big deal. If you got caught with one without a license, your TV would get confiscated and you'd get arrested. One day, Timothy received a letter stating that the owner of the TV he left behind had reported him to the police for owning a TV without a license. He immediately went to John for help, but John refused to intervene. And so Timothy did the only thing he could think of. He went to Beryl's parents and begged them to help him. Her parents agreed, and with their help, Timothy returned to his flat to retrieve the TV. It was then that Timothy discovered that John had gone, and that Beryl was alone in the flat with little Geraldine. It's unclear what happened next, but when Timothy came out of the bedroom, he had blood all over his hands and clothes. Beryl screamed and asked him what had happened. Timothy calmly replied, "I don't know." And then he just sat down. A little while later, Timothy called his neighbor, Mrs. McNamara, and told her he had killed Beryl and Geraldine. When the police arrived, they found Beryl and Geraldine both dead from axe wounds. They also noticed that the TV was missing. Timothy was immediately arrested. At first, Timothy said he was innocent, but under questioning, he confessed to killing his wife and daughter, but denied killing John. Timothy's confession was shaky at best. First, he claimed he bludgeoned his wife to death, but then he said he used an axe. When asked why he killed them, he said because he wanted them to stop crying. As the days passed, Timothy's story changed. At one point, he said he did it all for the sake of money. But when the police searched the flat, they found no evidence of a struggle. There was no sign that an axe had ever been used, nor was there any indication that anyone had stolen the TV. Timothy's story was falling apart. And then something new came along. A witness came forward claiming to have seen Timothy carrying a TV down the stairs the night of the murder. This witness also told police he'd seen Timothy with blood on his hands. Suddenly, Timothy's story changed again. He now said he killed John in a fit of rage, then struck his wife and daughter because he didn't want them to live without him. This time, the police believed him. On September 9, 1953, Timothy Evans was executed for the murder of his wife and daughter. So far, the story seems pretty straightforward. Evil person did evil thing and got caught, but here's where things get messed up. 5 years after Timothy's execution, a new tenant moved into John Christie's old flat. She found a trapdoor covered by a wardrobe. Inside the wardrobe, she found a key. She used the key to open the trapdoor, only to find a locked room inside. She reported it to the landlord, who broke down the door to find 6 bodies inside. The news of this discovery reached Scotland Yard, who promptly launched an investigation into the murders. They revisited Timothy's case, focusing on John Christie, who was now married to Ethel. John told police he hadn't lived with Timothy since 1951, but a neighbor told police she'd seen Timothy just a week before his arrest. She also told police that she'd heard a baby crying in the flat around the time of the murder. Other neighbors also came forward, saying they'd heard a baby crying that night. Then there was the matter of the bloody axe. Police searched Timothy's old flat and found traces of blood everywhere. It looked like a violent struggle had taken place, the complete opposite of what the original investigation had shown. Was Timothy really guilty? Police visited Timothy's grave at the family's request, disinterred the body, examined the bones, and concluded that Timothy had suffered no injuries consistent with an axe attack. Timothy had been killed by a lethal injection. With all this new evidence, the case was reopened and Timothy's conviction was overturned. He was completely innocent. But even though he was dead, nobody knew who killed Timothy's wife and daughter. That is until 1966. By that point, John Christie had served time for the murder of the woman he kept in his flat, and he was now living under a false identity. Police caught up with him and brought him in for questioning. When they searched his house, they found a secret room with the skeletons of several women, including Beryl and Geraldine. They also found a diary written by John confessing to the murders of at least 8 women. On December 15, 1966, John Christie was executed. Even though Timothy Evans was innocent, his case led to the suspension of the death penalty in the UK in 1965 and its eventual abolition in 1998. In 1997, More than 40 years after his wrongful execution, Timothy Evans was pardoned.